you wanted the best, you've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hey, folks, it's Voss here from the Chris Voss Show. He's doing that. Riley sings it. That makes it official. Welcome to the big show. As always, the Chris Voss Show. For nearly 20 years and 3,000 episodes of bringing the Chris Voss Show, it is the oldest, longest running podcast from the old days of when there's just a handful of us left, but we are the only ones still delivering 1 to 2 episodes new a day. So support us. Go to goodreads.com /Chris Voss, linkedin.com /Chris Voss, youtube.com /Chris Voss, and Chris Voss 1 on the TikTokity. Opinions expressed by guests on the podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the host or the Chris Voss Show. Some guests of the show may be advertising on the podcast, but it is not an endorsement or review of any kind. Today's featured author comes to us from bookstolifemarketing.co.uk. With expert publishing to strategic marketing, they help authors reach their audience and maximize their book's success. Today we're mentioning an amazing man on the show. We're going to be talking about his book and insights. It is entitled The Bible Can Be Proven, Unlocking Ancient Mysteries of Divine Imprint by Vincent Latorre. We're going to get with him and find out some of the deets, as the kids say. They don't say that. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. The kids are like, we don't say that. As a young boy, author Vince always had an inquisitive nature. He was immediately wanting answers to the questions such as, is there a God? How do I get here? How was the world and universe created? His search for those answers led to questions on a personal encounter with Christ at age 9 or 10. As his faith grew, his desire to analytically research and validate the Word of God intensified. He spent many hours in libraries and bookstores, sifting through more than 200 books and hundreds of articles on science, biblical, textual criticism, and theology. As he researched all of these, he began to see powerful scientific evidence for creation, as well as the evidence for historically reliability of the Bible. In his latest book, he shares the results of his research to strengthen believers and inform honest seekers. Welcome to the show, Vince. How are you, sir?
Thank you for having me. Congratulations on your long-running show.
Thank you. And thanks. Congratulations on your book. Books are really hard to write, so we all know what that's about. Give us a .coms. Where can people find you, sir, on the interwebs?
My website is thebiblecanbeproven.com, so it's the title of the book.com. I sell the book there. It can be bought on Amazon, but I also sell it on the website for a discounted price. Oh. There's also many articles on the website as well.
Go to the website, folks, and take advantage of those deals. Give us a 30,000 overview. What's inside the book in your words? It's
a book that demonstrates to me the reliability and divine inspiration of the Bible. That's what it was written for. Basically, I got into it. I've read a lot of books on that subject, as you said in my introduction. I love to read, and I've probably read hundreds of books on defending the faith, and just in both sides, really. I read the believers' books and the skeptics' books as well. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice to have a book that brings all these lines of evidence together in one place? And that's what this book does, and put it in a question and answer format. And not everybody wants to wade through huge tomes on theology or history or archaeology. So I thought with this book, I can do that for them, basically do the heavy lifting and just get out the nuggets, get out the essentials, and put them in a question and answer format in one book. So it's a one-stop shop.
One-stop shop. So now in your book, you say that the Bible can be proven. What do you mean by proven? And exactly, there's a lot of biblical scholars that they're kind of concerned about how accurate the Bible is. It's true. Mm-hmm. Many of the stories were written decades or hundreds of years after when stuff does. It's been highly edited. What do you mean by proven, I guess?
Okay. If you follow the line of my book, proven reliable. What does that mean? It means, first of all, what we have demonstrating that what we have is pretty much what was originally written. The second, but that doesn't do you good unless you know whether the history in it really happened. And so in archaeology and in other areas, you can talk about, did the characters in the Bible, were they real? Did these histories really happen? And the book aims to demonstrate that as well. But I don't stop there. I also highlight one particular central tenet of the Christian faith, which is the resurrection of Christ, and talk about a lot of historical facts that people don't know about that are pretty strong support for that event. And then finally, I hear sometimes parents who had their kid go off to university and the university professor attacks the Bible in some way, maybe says, oh, it's full of errors and contradictions, and it's just the words of men. I think you can demonstrate that it's a very unique book and that it's more than the words of men, that there's a divine superintendence behind it. And so there's a facet of the book that also goes into that as well. So proven reliable and also proven to be a unique and supernatural book.
Oh, wow. And when we're there, you did a lot of study and data on it and things of that nature. What are some of the questions I have for you? So what originally caused you to question whether the Bible is truly the Word of God?
I wanted to know. I read it through, I think, for the first time as a teenager, and I wanted to investigate the history of what was happening in the Bible. And so I did a lot of research into all the different areas. And I think I started out, as I said, as a response to some of the attacks that I heard on the Bible. And I started out writing a paper. And that's what it was going to be originally, a paper. And it grew and grew and became a book. There's a lot more. Ended up being 7 years worth of research. And I tried to get into the best scholarship in each area. And also and I also looked at the skeptics' books. Said, okay, give me your best stuff. Who's your best guy who says that the Bible's not reliable, and let's say manuscripts or archaeology, and read their arguments. And these are the same arguments that sometimes cause people to lose their faith. You've got people who say there's all kinds of variance between the New Testament copies, for example. There are a lot of variance.
There are
more than there are words in the New Testament. There's maybe 400,000 variants between the manuscripts, and there's 135,000 words in the whole New Testament. However, almost all those variants are totally insignificant. Spelling errors, things like that. Things like an apple versus a apple, that type of thing. And they're really not, when you come right down to it, the scholars who've really researched this will say that there's no significant cardinal doctrine of Christianity that's affected by these variants to any great degree. What's also interesting is that we have so many manuscripts, and this is what makes the transmission so certain. The Bible is way ahead of any other ancient document in terms of manuscript evidence. And in other words, you could say that one of the criteria to use for that is that, all right, how many manuscripts do you have of an ancient document? Of course, manuscript being a handwritten copy. And also, what's the time gap between the manuscripts and the time of the originals? How short is it? And when you look at those two things, the Bible is way ahead of any other competitor. And so that's one of the things I'd like to emphasize, too, is that your nearest competitor, now the Iliad's pretty good. It's got 1,900 manuscripts. There's a few others. I think Julius Caesar's work has 10 manuscripts. And most of the ancient documents have maybe only a dozen. The New Testament has 6,000.
Wow.
And that's just the Greek versions.
Wow.
Then you have all the translations of the New Testament, which amount to about 10,000.
Wow.
Then if you also have quotes from what's known as the early church fathers, and they go back to the first century forward, and you can actually reconstruct the entire New Testament from their quotations minus 11 verses. So that's the kind of support you don't have in any other ancient document by far.
Oh, wow. All right, then how do we take, and was there one discovery that transformed your belief from primary faith-based to evidence-based?
Oh, there's, I think, many.
Is there one that comes to mind, just pops to mind, maybe?
I'm thinking like scientifically.
Yeah,
more,
for evidence.
More along the lines of archaeology. You have the resurrection of Christ, which is based on some pretty solid facts that the resurrection of Christ seems to be the best explanation for. And these facts are ones that almost all scholars acknowledge are true, whether they're believers or skeptics. There's 5 of them that in particular that stand out. The crucifixion of Christ, the experiences that the disciples had that they experienced the risen Christ, the conversion of St. Paul, the conversion of James, the brother of Christ, and then the empty tomb. And when you put those together and you look at the different explanations for each one, the different proposed explanations, the one that handles all the data the best and handles the scope and the plausibility and the whole range of data is the resurrection. Now, as far as science goes, I think looking at, of course, the universe, the creation of the universe, without God, it's basically nothing went bang and there's the universe. But you need something outside of time and space. And actually in the book of Genesis, really is the only book that actually says that matter, space, and time had a beginning of all the ancient religious books. Most of the rest of them started out with matter being already there, a chaos. I think most recently, the one I hand out to atheists is about DNA. The program that's in our body is so amazingly complex. Yeah. This wasn't known a century ago. Now they're finding out that DNA is a 4-dimensional code. Not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4. You've got a linear dimension, a set of instructions. Basically, DNA is a set of instructions for the building of the body. And the type of instructions are in DNA are complex. You can read them in many different ways and use them in many different ways. They're having a procedure that was written forwards, backwards, every other letter, and they all mean something different. Then you got a second dimension that is like an internet where the genes communicate with each other, and the cell is like a vast internet. Then you've got the third dimension. The chromosomes are where the DNA is on the genes are on the chromosomes, and they're made of proteins, and they fold. And when they fold, they may be far apart on the chromosome, but when the chromosome folds, they come together in 3-dimensional space.
Oh.
And then finally, you have a time dimension where parts of the chromosome are unwrapped and rewrapped as they're needed to copy. I know I'm getting a little off of my book subject, but that's one thing that really is powerful. And I know Antony Flew was a famous atheist who used to debate people, and toward the end of his life, he became a believer in God because of the DNA evidence.
Wow. Now, one other question I had for you, if I can find my notes and questions here amongst all the data I've had, is there any historical evidence for Jesus outside of the Bible?
Yeah, you start with the Bible as an ordinary historical document. In other words, laying aside anything about supernatural inspiration or even errors. The Bible is a primary document, just as you have Julius Caesar's writings, the Gallic Wars, let's say, are primary documents for him. But you also have secular historians that mention him, like Cornelius Tacitus, a Roman historian mentions him, mentions the crucifixion, mentions that Pontius Pilate and crucified him, and also mentions the persecution that happened to Christians. Mentions him twice in his writings. And both of these were writing in about that contemporary time. They wrote a little bit later, but they were writing about events contemporary with Jesus. has one that's called the Testimonium. That's one that he mentions him the first time in one of his, I think it's against his book on the wars. He mentions Jesus as the brother, James, the brother of Jesus, who is the Christ. Oh. Interestingly enough, why would he mention it like that? Because Jesus was a very common name. So in order to make it more specific, he said, brother of Jesus is known as the Christ. And so he was really specifying him as though he was, and as though people maybe were familiar with that title. He mentioned them as what's called the Testimonium, in which he goes into a little more detail about him. And unfortunately, some of the copies of that have been, I think Christians maybe embellished it a little bit. But if you take away the embellishments, there's three theories about it. One, people say, oh, it's a total forgery. The other say, no, it's totally, every part of it is true. Or is part of something Josephus composed. And the third one, which I think is true, is that you got basically Josephus' structure, but then some embellishments by later Christians. And so the reason I think it's not forgery is because when you look at the structure, it's so characteristic of Josephus. He has some very unique ways of writing, and very doubtful that a forger would be able to mimic him that closely and would bother. I don't know if you've heard somebody who writes in a very distinctive way. It would be, in other words, the scholars who study it and who know Josephus know that isn't it's too characteristic of him. On the other hand, like in one case, Josephus says he was thought to be the Messiah, but the Christian version says he is the Messiah. In other words, and I don't have it. I can read it if you'd like. I can get it in front of me. But it's really the third part makes the most sense. And actually there's an Arabic version. The Greek version seems to be the ones that were changed, but the Arabic version is a much more cautious one, and it's something that we think Josephus would have written. Then you got Lucian of Samosata, a Greek satirist, who also mentions the crucifixion of Christ. Bar Serapion, you've got in the Jewish Talmud, they says on the eve of Passover they hanged Yeshua. Well, they said hanged, but they were talking about his crucifixion. They also mentioned his miracles, but they were a hostile source because they attributed his miracles to sorcery. And there's others. So there's actually 9 secular authors that mention him altogether, and 42 authors, if you count the Christian authors, that mention him in the first 150 years. That's interesting because Julius Caesar has only 5 in the first 150 years. He has 5 authors that mention him. Now, the biographies of Jesus, of course, if you look at the Gospels, there's about a 25 to 50 year gap between the earliest manuscripts and the Gospels. Now, look at Alexander the Great. There's no contemporary records that survive of him. The nearest ones are 400 years away. The ones they use is the most authoritative are about 500 years away. Yet people don't say, well, you don't know anything about Alexander, or that it's all fiction. So it seems like almost a double standard sometimes applied to the Bible.
I can't remember. Have they made a DNA profile on Jesus? Did he have any? He didn't really have any. I don't know. Isn't there a DNA lineage for everything these days? I don't know.
I don't know. They're finally able to sequence DNA pretty cheaply.
Yeah. They have the cloth of Turin or whatever.
You can get your own DNA sequence now, I guess. But the Shroud of Turin actually does have real blood, and I guess it's type O. I don't know if they actually sequenced the DNA. That I've got a book on the Shroud, which I've got to read yet. Yeah. It's got some very interesting properties. When I approached it at first, I was somewhat skeptical of it. I said, at least it shows that the crucifixion victims were buried, which a lot of people who deny the empty tomb try to say that Jesus wasn't buried. He was just thrown into a common grave. But when you look back at the practices of the day, the Jews really didn't allow that. And the Romans allowed them to bury even crucifixion victims. And of course, they found the crucifixion victim that had been buried. His name was Johannan. They found him with a nail driven through his heel.
Ow.
And it's a piece of wood. And they couldn't get the nail out, so they just apparently crucified him, wood and nail and all. And so they got,
insult to injury joke somewhere there. I don't know.
And so that proved to be a very valuable piece of evidence, because it showed that how they crucified, and that they crucified people who had been executed by, or they buried people that had been executed by crucifixion. So that's, I don't know if they've done the DNA, but the shroud is very provocative. There's some very unusual properties to the shroud that they've tried to explain away by being, definitely isn't painted. It's light on the surface. There's no way it could have been painted, because the paint would have sunk down into the fibers. And there's all kinds of, they did 120 hours of scientific testing, and they definitely ruled that out. Even they had a date for the shroud that was medieval, and they found out that was a part that had been redone. So that's another subject. I don't touch on that in the book. I mentioned it briefly, but that's another whole study.
That kind of brings insult to injury to have a nail stuck in your foot and they still crucify you.
Oh, I can't imagine the pain. They're just,
Something's afoot about that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right.
I had to get that joke in there. So.
You nailed it right there. Yeah.
Oh, you beat me to it. That was the good one. That was a good joke right there. Good job. All right. How do we know that Jesus rose from the dead? Is there proof of this? It seems zombie-ish, if you ask me, but what do I know?
It's a supernatural event. It's not something that you don't explain it in a natural way, but in the context of the existence of God. If you got a God who created the universe, how hard could it be to raise a dead body? But you got those, and then you got the evidence, you got the facts, and they need explaining.
Yeah,
You've got these disciples that were transformed from cowards into people ready to die for their faith. So it kind of shows they didn't make it up. If their Messiah had died and not risen, they either would have found a new Messiah or given up the movement. But they didn't. And you can't say it's like a pagan thing, because the pagans believed that when somebody died, they went to the other world, but they didn't believe in a bodily resurrection. And so that wasn't something that would have been borrowed from pagan myths. I'm going to expound on that a little more when I do a revised, expanded version, because there's still some people that try to say that. But you've had people who have had out of the body experiences, and maybe you've heard about some of those where they're out of their body and they see things that they shouldn't have been able to see. And
I might have had a couple nights of that with vodka, but they found they try to explain it away with drugs and with hallucinations, and none of it works. They've had people who describe things that they couldn't have possibly seen otherwise, and things going on in the room and things going on in other rooms while they're on the operating table unconscious and with their eyes closed. But anyway, that's just one aside. But the facts for Jesus' resurrection, the fact that the disciples had those experiences, you can't really say they made it up. And then if you say that they were hallucinations, problem. People don't have group hallucinations at the same time. They also not only do not have group hallucinations, but to have them all, different people, different times, and different places, to have the same hallucination is also something you don't see if you ask any psychologist. Hallucinations you've got several different kinds at once. Most hallucinations are like fleeting glimpses of a ghost. They don't usually cook breakfast for you. They don't usually eat a fish in front of you. Yeah.
You'd have to have an auditory hallucination, a visual hallucination, and a tactile hallucination all at once. Why did they all stop after 40 days? They all suddenly got cured of their hallucinations. And they weren't the type of people who were subject to that, especially Paul and James. James was a skeptic. He didn't believe in his own brother was anything special before Christ appeared to him. Paul didn't believe it either. He had to be convinced by an appearance.
Wow. Yeah, it's a book that people have argued about whether it's authentic or not for a long periods of time, and I guess we'll always argue about it. How does the Bible's prophecies differ from Nostradamus and other prophets?
Okay, there's a good example of that. Nostradamus, of course, was the French astrologer, and his prophecies were called quatrains. And the thing about them is that they're very vague, and you can almost put any interpretation to them that you like because they're so crazy. There's one that's supposed to predict the rise of Hitler, and it says something about Venus and they'll be against the Rhine and Easter, and that's supposed to represent Hitler. But in another version of the same prophecy, the Easter word is a river, the Danube and the Easter. And then there's another one that says that it supposedly predicts the death of Hitler. And it says something about the great one will be dragged in. There's something about everybody be against Hister, and the great one will be dragged into an iron cage where the German infant observes no law. Now, But first of all, that's kind of crazy. But when you look at it, first of all, it's in French. It's enfant de Germain. That doesn't mean German infant. It means a child brother. Oh. So an incorrect translation makes a river into Hitler and a relative into Germany. If the Bible was translated this way, it would have been ripped to shreds by critics a long time ago. How's the Bible possibly different? An example, there was a gentleman that I wrote about. His name was Dr. White. He was an atheist and a physical chemist. And he approached the Bible at first thinking that prophecies in the Bible were like Nostradamus, that they were so vague that you could put almost anything to them. And what he found, he investigated a prophecy about the city of Samaria written by prophet Micah about 700 BC. And in that prophecy, it said several things about Samaria that would be like a heap of a field. Vineyards would be planted there, that its foundations, its rocks would be thrown down into a valley, and that its foundations would be discovered. So I said, okay, those are pretty specific. Yeah. Not like Nostradamus, who said Nostradamus' latest one was in 1999, there'll be something about the king of Mongols will do something for good luck. It's like, boy, that's real clear.
Yeah.
So Dr. White looked at that and said, sure enough, you look at Samaria today, the prophecies didn't really get fulfilled until about 2,000 years later. Oh. And what happened is Arabs wanting to use the site for agricultural purposes dug up the foundations and threw them down to a nearby valley. And today you can see vineyards planted on the site and where they have. But it didn't. In other words, it wasn't something that was fulfilled before the fact or soon after. It took a long time after for it to be fulfilled.
Oh, wow.
You've also got the city of Tyre, or Tyre, as they say in Lebanon. That's how they pronounce it, Tyre. That was very unusual in that it was destroyed by, as the Bible talks about it, having its timber and rubble and rocks and thrown into the sea. And it was also prophesied that it would be a place for the spreading of nets and fishermen. And that would be that Tyre was a big merchant city. If I had a map, I could show it. It was on the Mediterranean. Big merchant city. It was a center of commerce. And the Bible talks about that all being just that going away, that it was just basically be built no more like it was. And what happened, and then the prophecy says, I will bring against Tyre Nebuchadnezzar. That happened. No, the prophet who wrote that was Ezekiel. And he's very firmly dated in the 580, 590 BC range. And so when he wrote that, Nebuchadnezzar came in about 15 years later. So you could probably argue, well, maybe he saw that coming. But Nebuchadnezzar, Tyre had two cities. It had an island, it had a mainland city, and then it had an island city, fortified city, out about a mile or two. And when Nebuchadnezzar attacked, he only had land forces. So he was attacking, sieging the main city, but meanwhile, Tyre shipped all its stuff out to the island city. So Nebuchadnezzar didn't get any spoil.
Oh, wow.
He was like...
He shipped it off.
Yeah, they shipped it out to the island city. And so he did attack it just like Ezekiel prophesied. And it was very specific. He'll come against it with engines of war and battering rams and so on, and he did. But he couldn't attack the island city. So all of a sudden, 240 years later, comes a military genius named Alexander the Great. He tried to attack the island city of Tyre, but he couldn't get near it because they would shoot things at him, and he didn't really have a way of getting to the walls. So what does he do? He decides to build a causeway out to the island. And what does he do? He takes the timber, the dust, and the stones of the mainland city and throws it into the water. 240 years later from the prophecy. And of course, the people first they laughed at him. Then they realized he's really succeeding. He's getting this. Yeah. So they sent their navies against him, and he enlisted other countries to follow them. And he ended up conquering. He built a causeway out to the city. He ended up conquering the city of Tyre.
Yeah, maybe the Germans should have done that to Europe or Britain.
Yeah, and it's like...
Of course, it would have took a lot of dirt and rock.
Very specific. Yeah, he was amazing what he did. It was, and eventually it turned into a peninsula. As the sediment accumulated, it turned into a peninsula. And guess what there is today? There's a little fishing village there, and fishermen are spreading their nets on the rocks.
Go.
Just like it was prophesied, 2,500 years ago.
That's pretty wild. People can read your book and go through all your research that you have there and the good stuff, and find what you studied and how you studied it and the details of facts, right?
Yes. It's a very good bibliography. If you want to delve into biblical archaeology, there's a 400-page book I reference on that. If you want to get into the resurrection of Christ and the historical evidence behind that, there's 2 books I've got referenced. One is 800 pages. One is 700 pages. So a lot of people don't want to wade through those, but maybe some of you do. Oh. Yeah, they're all listed. And I said I tried to get the best scholars. For example, I got one by Gary Habermas, who I think has written more on the resurrection evidence for Christ than anyone else. Top-notch scholar, Habermas. If you want to look up his book, it's called The Case for the Resurrection. It's really, really good. If you want to get into what they call the minimal facts approach, which is what I explained earlier, the 5 facts, he really gets into it in detail and shows all the counter arguments. And so, I encourage people not to just take my word for it. Dig into it for yourself. Do the research yourself and come to your own conclusions. I know the more I study, the more my faith grows.
Thank you very much for coming to the show. Give us your .com one last time as we go out so people can look you up over there.
TheBibleCanBeProven.com.
There you go.
And also Amazon. You can find my book on there as well.
All right. Vince, thank you very much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Thank you for coming. The book is entitled The Bible Can Be Proven, Unlocking Ancient Mysteries, a Divine Imprint. Be sure to pick it up wherever fine books are sold. Thanks so much for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com/Chris Voss, YouTube.com/Chris Voss, and all those crazy places in it. Be good to each other. Stay safe. We'll see you guys next.
You've been listening to the most amazing, intelligent podcast ever made to improve your brain and your life. Warning, consuming too much of the Chris Voss Show podcast can lead to people thinking you're smarter, younger, and irresistible sexy. Consume in regularly moderated amounts. Consult a doctor for any resulting brain bleed.